Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine you're walking around and you're surrounded by invisible forces, electromagnetic fields.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some are obvious, like the Wi-Fi or the power lines, the ones we create. But then there are others, natural ones, actually coming from the planet itself.
That's right. These fields are, well, they're truly ubiquitous, everywhere. From the hum of our technology to the really subtle fundamental energies of the Earth.
And it leads to this really compelling question, doesn't it? Could these unseen fields, both the ones we generate and the ancient ones of the Earth, could they actually be influencing something as profound as our brains?
Or even our consciousness.
Yeah, maybe even our moment-to-moment well-being. It feels like something out of science fiction almost.
It does, but it's rooted in real science.
Okay.
And that's precisely the deep dive we're taking today. We're going to explore the fascinating and, yeah, sometimes controversial connection between electromagnetic fields.
EMFs, right?
Yeah, EMFs. Specifically, the weak, extremely low-frequency kind, like the Earth's own atmospheric rhythms, the Schumann resonances.
Ah, yes.
And biological systems, including the human brain, and even some pretty cutting-edge theories of consciousness.
Right. And to do this, we've pulled together quite a range of sources. We've got research papers looking into different theories of consciousness, studies investigating how both humans and animals seem to respond to these fields. A look at the tricky business of how you even detect such subtle signals.
Which isn't easy.
No. And also practical discussions around shielding ourselves from EMF and what that might actually imply.
So our goal in this deep dive, really, is to try and cut through the complexity here. We want to help you navigate these sources, understand the core findings, the theories.
See where the data points lead versus where maybe the hypotheses take over.
Exactly. And highlight the absolute most important nuggets of information about this really intricate relationship. Fields, biology, and potentially conscious experience.
Think of this as your shortcut, maybe, to being truly well-informed on a subject that feels like it's becoming more relevant every single day. So let's start with the electromagnetic landscape we actually live in. There are the man-made fields, which are just, they're growing exponentially, right?
They really are.
Everything from your phone to cell towers to the rollout of 5G adds to this electromagnetic soup.
Absolutely. And we're primarily talking about non-ionizing EMF or NEMF. These are frequencies in the range of 0 hertz all the way up to 300 gigahertz.
Right.
Now, it's crucial to understand they're different from ionizing radiation, like X-rays.
Right, the dangerous stuff.
Well, ionizing radiation carries enough energy to actually knock electrons off atoms, cause DNA damage. NEM generally doesn't have that kind of energy.
So it doesn't typically cause atomic ionization or even significant tissue heating, unless it's really strong.
Exactly, except at a very high power levels, very close to the source.
And it's that lack of significant heating that makes the whole potential health discussion so tricky and, well, controversial, isn't it?
Precisely. For decades, the focus on potential health hazards, initially it was power lines, remember?
Oh, yeah.
Now it's increasingly wireless devices and infrastructure that focus has really been based on thermal effects. Essentially, does the field heat tissue?
And the safety guidelines reflect that.
They do. Current guidelines from major bodies like ICNIRP or the FCC, they're primarily designed to protect against this known danger of heating.
But the sources you've gathered, they suggest there might be effects beyond just heating things up.
They do. There's a growing body of data pointing towards discernible non-thermal effects.
Meaning?
Biological changes occurring at levels where heating just isn't a factor. And this has led to, well, significant debate and calls for more research.
Especially independent research.
Particularly studies that aren't funded by industries that, profit from these technologies. It's a real point of contention. In fact, the FCC has recently been challenged in court.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and prompted to revisit its standards, basically look again in light of this newer information on non-thermal effects.
In the meantime, people talk about reducing exposure.
Right, simple things like increasing your distance from a device or just limiting your usage time. Those are often suggested as ways to, minimize exposure to man-made fields.
Okay, so that's the external world of fields. But our brains aren't just passive receivers, are they? They're also powerful generators of their own electrical and magnetic activity.
They absolutely are. Every thought, every sensation involves these incredibly complex electrical processes within our neurons.
Like those little voltage spikes. Action potentials.
Exactly, those brief voltage spikes called action potentials, and also the tiny electrical signals pass between neurons at the synapses, the little connection points.
And basic physics tells us if you have electrical activity, you get electromagnetic fields.
That's it. Just like any electrical circuit generates a magnetic field, the electrical activity of the brain generates its own, although, admittedly, very weak electromagnetic fields.
How weak are we talking?
Well, a single neuron's electrical spark, that action potential, involves a minuscule amount of energy, like truly tiny.
So how could those tiny fields possibly amount to anything significant?
Well, individually they are incredibly weak. But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
When thousands or even millions of neurons fire together synchronously, meaning their electrical activity is coordinated, it's aligned.
Like they're all firing in rhythm.
Precisely. Then their individual tiny fields can actually combine. They add up to create a much stronger, larger-scale electromagnetic field that extends beyond the individual neurons themselves.
And that's what we can pick up.
That's what we detect with tools like EEG, measuring electrical activity on the scalp, or MEG, measuring the magnetic fields just outside the head.
Wow. And this collective, synchronized electrical symphony. This leads us directly into some of the most intriguing and maybe mind-bending theories about what consciousness actually is.
It really does. The idea being explored is that consciousness might not reside solely in the neural matter itself, the brain cells,
But in the field.
but could somehow be intimately related to this large-scale electromagnetic field generated by all that synchronized brain activity. Which brings us to these electromagnetic field theories of consciousness, often shortened to EM2Cs.
Okay, EM2Cs.
And these theories propose a pretty radical idea, that the brain's own EM field is the physical substrate of consciousness itself.
Whoa. That's a big leap from saying brain activity just correlates with consciousness, which we kind of know.
It is a huge leap. These theories partly emerged because, as we just said, synchronous neuronal firing is so consistently observed when someone is conscious. It's a really strong neural correlate of consciousness, an NCC.
Right.
So EM2C suggests the EM field could be the answer to the famous binding problem.
Binding problem, how we perceive things as a whole.
Exactly. Think about it. You see, a red ball rolling across the grass. Different parts of your brain are processing the color red, the shape of a ball, the movement, the texture of grass.
All separate signals.
Right. How do all these separate neural signals bind together into that single unified conscious experience of seeing a red ball rolling?
Okay, yeah, how does that happen?
EM Pictures propose the brain's EM field acts as the binder. It integrates all this distributed information into one coherent whole.
So the field isn't just some byproduct like exhaust from an engine. It's more like the canvas where the conscious picture is actually painted.
That's the concept, yeah. And related to this is the idea that consciousness requires sufficient complexity to sort of encode a thought.
Okay.
Now, defining this complexity purely in terms of neurons is tough, but EM Textus suggests the EM field itself must have that complexity.
And if it doesn't?
Well, they point to examples like highly rhythmic but very simple information-poor EEG patterns during certain kinds of seizures.
Which often involve loss of consciousness.
Exactly. The idea is maybe the field, while strong, isn't complex enough, isn't encoding rich information. There's even one specific theory, semi-field theory.
CEMI. C-E-M-I.
Yeah. It proposes that the brain's own internal endogenous EM field can actually influence how neurons fire back.
Influence the neurons.
Yes, and that this interaction, this feedback loop, is what we experience as free will.
Wow.
The idea is neurons are both sending signals and receiving information from the collective field they create.
So the brain is like a giant, complex radio station, broadcasting and receiving its own thoughts through its electromagnetic field.
It's a powerful analogy, yeah, though maybe a bit too simple for the incredibly complex dynamics involved, but it captures the essence.
Okay.
And building on this, other theories look specifically at resonance and synchrony. The general resonance theory, or GRT, suggests that synchrony, harmonization, or resonance is absolutely fundamental to consciousness.
Like tuning forks vibrating together at the same frequency, that kind of idea.
It uses that kind of analogy, yes. GRT proposes that shared resonance between what it calls microconscious parts, maybe individual neurons, maybe even smaller elements, allows for the emergence of higher-level macroconscious entities, like our overall human consciousness.
So resonance allows the parts to combine into a greater whole.
That's the idea. This shared resonance, they argue, allows information to flow much faster and with much greater complexity between the parts, enabling a richer conscious experience. It might solve the combination problem, how little bits of consciousness combine.
And there are other related theories.
Yeah, a related idea, coherence field theory, suggests there's an overarching EM field that organizes cellular processes, biochemical pathways.
Organizes them.
Yes, and that EM radiation within this field acts as a kind of binder for biological structures, from molecules up to tissues. Our basic perceptions, maybe even qualities like awareness or will, could emerge from this electromagnetic coherence.
Okay, these are incredible ideas. Linking consciousness itself to these physical concepts, fields, resonance, coherence, but the big question still looms, doesn't it? Do they really explain the why? Why does this physical process, a field resonating or cohering or whatever, lead to my subjective experience, my first-person perspective? That feeling of being me.
That's the absolute heart of the challenge. As the sources definitely highlight, there's still what philosophers call the explanatory gap.
The hard problem.
The hard problem of consciousness, exactly. These theories offer fascinating potential physical mechanisms and correlates, things we can maybe measure, but they don't fully bridge that gap to explaining the qualitative feel of consciousness, what it's like to see red or feel pain.
So what's the path forward?
Well, the hope expressed is that truly interdisciplinary work, getting physicists and neuroscientists collaborating intensely and really viewing the brain not just as a network of wires, but as an EM system, an object interacting with fields that might help close this gap eventually.
And it sounds incredibly difficult to even begin measuring something like a physical correlate of consciousness itself, separate from just, brain activity.
Oh, it is. Researchers are working really hard to find reliable, measurable correlates of consciousness, MCCs, but it's a huge challenge because standard measures like EEG or fMRI often show activity even when consciousness seems diminished or absent.
So one test won't cut it.
Probably not. It's likely going to require a whole battery of tests, new approaches, looking at dynamics and complexity in ways we haven't before, not just one single measure.
Okay, so we have our brains generating their own subtle EM fields. Now let's shift our perspective and look outwards. At the planet itself, it has its own fundamental electromagnetic rhythm, right? The Schumann resonances.
Yes, the Schumann resonances, or SR, they're these natural global electromagnetic oscillations. You have to picture the space between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere.
That layer way up in the atmosphere.
Right, about 60 miles up, maybe a bit more.
Yeah.
That whole space acts like a giant enclosed cavity, like a spherical waveguide.
Okay, cavity. And what makes it resonate? What gets it ringing?
The primary driver is global lightning activity. Every time there's a lightning strike anywhere on Earth, and there are thousands happening all the time, it acts like a massive electromagnetic pulse.
Like hitting a bell.
Exactly like hitting a giant bell.
Yeah.
It excites this Earth ionosphere cavity, causing electromagnetic waves to bounce around inside. And these waves interfere with each other to create standing waves at specific, very stable, extremely low frequencies.
Which are those ELF frequencies we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Extremely low frequency.
Exactly. The fundamental frequency, the main one, is quite low, around 7.8 hertz, 7.8 cycles per second.
Which is interesting because...
Because that's right in the range of human brain waves, particularly the border between theta and alpha waves.
Yeah.
And then there are harmonic overtones, like musical harmonics, appearing higher up at roughly 14 hertz, 20 hertz, 26, 33, 39, and 45 hertz. Again, overlapping with alpha and beta brainwave ranges.
Fascinating overlap. But detecting these planetary rhythms must be incredibly difficult. They must be tiny signals compared to all the man-made electrical noise around us.
They are indeed very weak signals, yeah. Measuring them reliably requires specialized equipment designed for extreme sensitivity. And you need sophisticated methods to filter out all the background noise.
Like the 60 hertz hum from power lines.
Exactly. The hum from power lines, radio stations, all sorts of electronic interference. You need really sensitive magnetic antennas, often made with special high permeability materials to help capture these minute magnetic field changes.
And serious filtering.
Oh, yeah. And then carefully design electronic amplifiers and filtering systems, things like notch filters, to specifically remove power line frequencies just to isolate the target SR frequencies from all the other noise. It's a significant technical challenge to reliably detect the Earth's faint pulse against the electrical roar of modern life.
Okay, so given that our brains operate with EM fields, and the Earth has these natural EM rhythms pulsing away at similar frequencies.
Yeah.
The really compelling question is, do these natural fields actually interact with our biology?
Does one affect the other?
Yeah. Are there studies looking at this?
There absolutely are, and some earlier research offered hints, even before focusing specifically on SR.
Like what?
For example, scientists noticed years ago that changes in the Earth's overall magnetic field associated with things like solar flares causing geomagnetic disturbances.
Geomagnetic storms.
Right. Those seem to correlate with subtle changes in human biology, things like reduced levels of melatonin metabolites. Melatonin being that key hormone for sleep and circadian rhythms.
Interesting.
They also linked geomagnetic activity, just the general background fluctuations, to effects on physiological states, even psychological states in some studies. One study even noted enhanced vestibular experiences, sense of balance, motion in people during brief sensory deprivation periods when geomagnetic activity was higher.
So some historical evidence suggesting natural fields might influence us in various ways. What about the Schumann resonances specifically? Did any of the sources look at their direct impact on something really fundamental like sleep?
Yes, and this is fascinating. One source detailed a study specifically using a device designed to generate Schumann resonance frequencies, the main 7.8 hertz one, I believe.
Oh, okay.
It was used in a double-blinded, randomized trial for people suffering from chronic insomnia.
So proper scientific setup.
Yes, double-blind, placebo-controlled. It involved 40 participants, mostly women, average age around 50, who had a long history of sleep problems. One group used the SR generating device near their bed. The other used an identical-looking placebo device for 4 weeks.
And what did they measure? How do they track sleep?
They measured sleep in 2 ways, objectively using polysomnography.
The sleep lab test.
Right, that's the gold standard sleep lab test that tracks brain waves, EEG, eye movements, EOG, muscle tension, EMG, heart rate, giving really solid data on things like how long it takes to fall asleep, total sleep time, sleep stages, and so on.
Okay. And the other way?
And subjectively, using standard tools like sleep diaries, where people record their own perceptions, and questionnaires assessing sleep quality, daytime sleepiness, satisfaction with sleep.
Got it. And the results? What happened?
The results were pretty striking. In the group using the actual SR device, both the objective measures from the polysomnography specifically, they fell asleep significantly faster, their sleep onset latency decreased, and their total sleep time increased.
Wow. Objectively measured.
Objectively measured. And their subjective measures, how they felt they slept, their reported daytime sleepiness, their satisfaction, all showed significant improvement compared to baseline.
Okay. And the placebo group?
Now, the placebo group did see some subjective improvement in certain measures, which is very common with placebo effects in sleep studies. People expect to sleep better, so they report sleeping a bit better.
Right.
But critically, their objective sleep measures from the lab test, the polysomnography data, did not improve significantly.
That's a really key distinction, isn't it? An objective physical measure of sleep improving specifically with the SR device, not just a subjective feeling.
It is. It's a crucial finding. The study concluded, based on this, that exposure to SR frequencies could indeed reduce insomnia symptoms, supported by both objective and subjective data.
That's quite something. Any caveats?
Well, the researchers themselves pointed out that the study was relatively small, only 40 people, and they called for more research to really understand the underlying mechanisms. How does the SR field interact with the brain or body to improve sleep, and also to look at the long-term effects. But still, pretty compelling initial results.
Definitely. I think I saw another study mentioned in the sources looking at SR and maybe blood pressure or heart rate.
Yes, that was another interesting one. This study didn't use a device, but instead compared participants' cardiovascular measures on days when the naturally occurring Schumann resonance signal intensity was just normal versus days when it happened to be enhanced or stronger based on environmental monitoring data.
So comparing natural variation.
Okay.
Well, and what did they find?
They observed that several key measures, things like group mean systolic and diastolic blood pressure, mean arterial pressure, and something called the double product, which relates to heart workload, were consistently lower on the days with enhanced, stronger SR signals compared to the normal SR days.
So potentially a connection between the Earth's stronger natural pulse and lower blood pressure or cardiac stress.
Potentially, yes. It suggests a possible relaxing or regulating effect.
Did individual health status seem to matter in how people responded?
It seemed to, yeah. They found an interesting correlation. The degree to which a person's blood pressure responded to the enhanced SR was negatively associated with having existing disease-related illnesses.
Meaning sicker people responded less.
Or differently, perhaps, and it was positively associated with having a higher healthy lifestyle score. So it suggests your overall health status might influence how your body tunes into or responds to these natural environmental rhythms.
Fascinating. Gender differences, too.
They also noted some differences in the response patterns between men and women, suggesting potential sex-specific effects that need more exploration. And again, like the sleep study, they emphasized this was a relatively small group and called for larger studies to confirm these findings and explore mechanisms.
Makes sense. And beyond sleep and blood pressure, were there any other hints of biological effects mentioned in the sources, maybe at different levels?
Yes, the sources touched on a few other areas, kind of painting a broader picture. For instance, some developmental studies looking at very weak, low-frequency magnetic fields like 7 Hz, close to the fundamental SR in lab animals, specifically rats,
Okay.
showed effects when exposure happened perinatally, around birth, things like changes in body weight gain and brain weight. And complex interactions were seen with things like nitric oxide modulation affecting development. It suggests these fields might influence basic developmental processes.
And at the cellular level,
Oh.
anything there?
Yeah, there was also mention of research suggesting that even exposure to radio frequency fields, RF EMF like from mobile phones, could influence fundamental cellular processes over the long term. One study found significant upregulation of genes related to autophagy.
Autophagy, that's like the cell's cleanup crew, right?
Yeah.
Recycling old parts.
Exactly, a crucial cellular maintenance process. This finding built on previous work suggesting that low-frequency EMF might also modulate autophagy in cells. So it highlights that researchers are probing these EMF interactions at multiple biological scales, from whole-body systems like sleep and circulation, down to developmental trajectories, and even fundamental cellular mechanisms.
Okay, so if these natural fields, like the Schumann resonances, might actually be important for our biology, maybe even beneficial, what happens when we try to shield ourselves from the man-made electromagnetic world? Does that have unintended consequences?
That's a really critical question that comes up in the sources. The common approach to shielding from man-made EMF, especially the higher frequency stuff like Wi-Fi and cell signals, involves using conductive materials.
Usually metals.
Typically metals, yeah. Used in things like special shielding paints, conductive fabrics for clothing or bed canopies, or even integrated into building materials for entire rooms.
Like creating a mini Faraday cage around yourself.
Exactly the principle. Metals have those free electrons that reflect or absorb electromagnetic waves, creating a barrier that significantly attenuates or weakens the fields trying to pass through. And it can be very effective at reducing exposure to man-made radio frequency or microwave fields inside the shielded space.
Which sounds like a good thing if you're concerned about potential health effects from those exposures.
On the surface, yes. But here's the potential downside, the catch, that's highlighted quite clearly in the source material. While metallic shielding is great at blocking man-made fields,
It blocks everything else too.
it also blocks, or at least significantly attenuates, the natural electromagnetic fields penetrating from the outside, including those potentially beneficial, extremely low-frequency Schumann resonances.
Ah, right. So in trying to protect yourself from one kind of field, you might inadvertently be disconnecting yourself from another kind of field that could actually be important for your well-being.
That's precisely the concern raised. And it builds on some older, quite famous experiments from decades ago where volunteers live in specially constructed underground bunkers shielded from virtually all external EMF.
What happened?
They reported various negative health effects, disrupted circadian rhythms, headaches, things like that. And interestingly, these symptoms were reportedly alleviated when a weak 10 Hz field close to SR frequencies was artificially introduced into the shielded environment.
Wow. So that hints that maybe we need some connection to these natural fields.
It suggests that possibility, yes, that these natural fields like SR might play a subtle but important role in maintaining biological rhythmicity, synchronization, maybe overall well-being. So the concern is that extensive, permanent shielding could inadvertently disrupt this natural connection.
So what's the alternative then, if shielding has this potential drawback?
Well, based on this concern, simpler mitigation strategies are often presented in the sources as potentially safer alternatives, at least until we have more definitive research. Things we mentioned earlier.
Like increasing distance, reducing time.
Exactly. Increasing your distance from strong sources, minimizing usage time for wireless devices, using wired connections when possible. These reduce exposure without creating a total electromagnetic void. The sources even make a specific call for urgent research
Into what?
into the safety and efficacy of shielding methods, combined with using specialized generators that could reintroduce weak pulses, mimicking natural atmospheric resonances, like SR, inside the shielded environment.
Huh. So shield the bad, but maybe add back the potentially good.
That's the idea being floated, but it highlights how complex this is. We don't fully understand the biological role of natural fields yet.
It really does create a complex picture then, pulling all these threads together.
Yeah.
Our brains are fundamentally electromagnetic systems.
Right, generating their own fields through synchrony.
Then we have these radical EM-based theories, exploring consciousness itself, linking it to the brain's field, trying to solve things like the binding problem.
Yeah, proposing the field as the substrate.
And then the Earth has its own natural EM rhythms, the Schumann resonances,
Yeah.
pulsing away at frequencies that overlap significantly with our own brainwaves.
The 7.8 hertz fundamental and its harmonics.
And these preliminary studies we discussed are hinting, just hinting, that these natural fields might actually influence basic biological functions like sleep regulation and maybe even blood pressure.
Exactly. It suggests a potentially intricate interplay between our internal bioelectromagnetic state and the external electromagnetic environment, both natural and man-made.
And weaving through all this, I remember you mentioning this really speculative idea from one source about accessing information.
Yes. That was definitely stretching the boundaries, presented as highly speculative. But the idea floated was, if information related to consciousness is somehow represented electromagnetically within the brain's field.
Okay, big if.
Huge if. And if that brain field interacts in some way with the Earth's larger field, could there theoretically be ways to, access or influence this information by artificially reconfiguring or simulating certain brain states or field patterns?
Wow.
It's a concept that, borders on science fiction, especially when they mention brain areas like the hippocampal formation, heavily involved in memory and spatial navigation. It's very much out there, as you said, based on the sources.
That is definitely out there.
Yeah.
But I guess it shows how broadly researchers are willing to think about the possibilities when you start considering the brain as an electromagnetic object interacting with its environment.
It does, and it's not just consciousness theories. I saw you also noted a mention of EM concepts even showing up in very practical biological repair.
Yeah, that seemed interesting.
Yes. As another example of this intersection, some research is exploring the use of magnetic nanoparticles embedded within structures called electrospun scaffolds. The idea is to use magnetic fields to potentially help guide or stimulate nerve tissue regeneration on these scaffolds.
So using EM principles to potentially help heal the body.
Exactly. It just highlights again how understanding electromagnetic principles and their interaction with biological systems is opening up avenues in diverse areas, from fundamental questions about consciousness to potential therapeutic applications.
So where does this all leave us?
Okay.
What does this all add up to? It's crystal clear this is a deeply complex and definitely a rapidly evolving area of research.
Absolutely. It's really multifaceted. We've covered the increasing prevalence of man-made fields, the complexities around non-ionizing radiation, and the ongoing questions about potential non-thermal health effects that current standards may not fully address.
Right. And we've explored these truly intriguing, almost philosophical theories that propose the brain's own electromagnetic activity, particularly that synchronous firing, could be the very physical basis of consciousness itself, tackling huge challenges like the binding problem.
Proposing the EM field as the integrator, the seat of subjective experience. And then we've looked at the planet's own natural rhythms, the Schumann resonances.
Earth's heartbeat, sort of.
Yeah, frequencies that serendipitously match some of our own key brainwave frequencies. And we've seen preliminary studies suggesting these natural fields might have real measurable effects on biological processes like sleep patterns and blood pressure regulation.
But this landscape, it just leaves us with so many critical open questions, doesn't it?
It really does. What are the precise biological mechanisms? How exactly might such incredibly weak fields, both the natural ones and the low-level man-made ones, actually exert influence on cells, tissues, the brain?
And what are the crucial threshold levels? Is there a dose response? Does it matter if it's pulsed or continuous?
Exactly. What are the long-term implications of chronic exposure to this ever-increasing level of man-made electromagnetic noise? Or conversely, what are the implications of potentially disconnecting ourselves from the natural fields through extensive shielding?
And the biggest question, perhaps, Do the theoretical links between electromagnetic fields and the fundamental nature of consciousness actually hold up as research progresses? Or will they remain fascinating but ultimately unproven ideas?
So much still to learn.
There really is so much more to understand. But it does leave you, doesn't it, with a truly profound idea to sort of sit with and think about.
It certainly does, and it might be this. Could our deeply ingrained biological rhythms, everything from the simple timing of our sleep-wake cycles to potentially even the subtle nature of conscious experience itself, could these be subtly, perhaps even fundamentally, attuned to the planet's own ancient electromagnetic pulse, the Schumann resonances?
Like we're biologically tuned into the Earth's frequency? And if so, what might the increasing cacophony of man-made electromagnetic noise in our modern environment actually mean for that delicate ancient attunement? What could it mean for our overall health and well-being in the long run?
It's a powerful thought, isn't it? A real reminder that we are intrinsically part of a much larger electromagnetic environment in ways we're probably only just beginning to truly comprehend.
Well, we hope this deep dive has given you a valuable shortcut into this incredibly fascinating and sometimes confusing subject. We definitely encourage you to stay curious, maybe look up some of the references if you want to go even deeper into the source materials themselves.